So, welcome everybody. I'd like to thank my friends and colleagues at the RSIS Centre for Multilateralism Studies for hosting this event. I'd also like to thank Simon Evanet, our speaker, and Eunice Wang and Patrick Lowe, our discussants. This topic couldn't be more timely or relevant. Digital trade was already booming before last year. And since the COVID pandemic, its growth has increased considerably. It's reckoned to have been anywhere around 5 to 6 trillion already in 2019, and it will be globally, and it will be a good deal more now. The growth of digital trade has been matched by a growth in policy interventions in the area, reflecting a range of concerns about issues ranging from data management to taxation. This policy debate is taking place in the absence of an adequate international framework, and it's also taking place all too often in the absence of adequate information about the nature and impact of policy interventions. So there's a real risk of incoherent and fragmentary policy responses leading to, ultimately, if we're not careful, a fragmented internet and greatly distorting the potential of digital trade to foster growth and development. The work that Simon Evanet will present today is aimed at helping to fill that information gap, and in my view makes a considerable contribution to doing that. It grows out of the work that he and his colleagues at St. Gallen have already done in the global trade alerts, which for the last decade or so have mapped developments in trade policy concerning goods, chiefly, and this has made a real contribution to knowledge and policy making, not least because as an independent organization, they're not subject to some of the same editorial constraints and political sensitivities that, for example, the WTO is. The digital policy alert, which they've started up recently, aims at filling the policy information gap in the same way for digital policies, mapping digital policies, and also considering their attributes, not just listing them. It should be, I think, a considerable contribution to informed policy making and hopefully more coherent policy making. And this, I think, be of considerable interest to Singapore, which has, as we know, taken a lead in open digital policies through agreements such as DEPA. So I'm looking forward very much to this topic, this conversation. It couldn't be, as I say, more timely or more relevant. And before I hand over to Simon, just a couple of administrative points. Firstly, if you want to ask questions, use the Q&A function. It'll come through to me. I will then put it to the member of the panel. Please indicate who your question is for. What we're going to do is Simon will speak, then I'll invite Eunice to speak, and then Patrick, and then we'll take questions at an appropriate point. After a couple of questions, I'll invite Simon and the others, as it may be, to reply. So there you are. That's all from me. I hope we have a very interesting and rewarding debate. I'm sure we will. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you very much, Evan. Can you see the full screen, or do we have the split screen for the slides?
I've got you full screen.
Great. All right. Excellent. Well, let's thank you for that. And let me begin by thanking you, Evan, and also RSIS for this opportunity to present the work of the Digital Policy Alert. although it is going to be me presenting this work and trying to answer your questions. There is a team of us working on this initiative, and a very prominent member of that team is my colleague Johannes Fritz, and he will, from time to time, you may see him presenting this, me presenting this, but we're both talking about the same thing, which is exactly what you identified, Evan, which is trying to fill in this amazing information deficit that we have on such a critical area of regulation. And I say critical area of regulation because, as you noted, Evan, digital technologies are general purpose technologies which are underlying the economic transformations of our societies at all levels of development, but not just industrialized countries, but we also have middle income countries, and many lower income countries are finding ways to exploit internet technologies so as to be able to advance their social and economic interests. The data gap is really cast in stark relief when you make some poignant comparisons. If you want to find a tariff rate that's charged on the importation of a good, you know exactly where to go. If a country is a WTO member, you can go to the WTO website and find out what the maximum tariff charge can be. If you're interested in the fiscal policy stance of a country, then you go to the IMF's website. If you're interested in how well they're doing in tracking poverty, you go to the World Development Indicators of the World Bank. But where do you go if you want to start getting detailed information systematically organized in a way which allows for comparisons across countries in the area of digital policy? What I want to argue is that this area is woefully under-recorded. And yet, as you noted, Evan, it's an area of incredible action or activity by governments who are seeking to regulate the digital space. And so what my colleagues and I sought to do is to develop an initiative which will advance mapping in this area. And perhaps what I'll do next is to start with why did we do this, and then acknowledge the important work that others have done up until now, and then talk about the benefits of this type of mapping exercise, and then take you through what we've actually done up until now, and perhaps conclude with a discussion of emerging policy trends, which we're seeing from our early warning initiative. So that's how I'm going to structure the rest of my presentation. Well, let's start with why. Why is this a first order issue which needs to be recorded, mapped, and addressed? Well, we are seeing what I would characterize as nothing less than a regulatory overdrive by governments. And this overdrive does not appear to me to be particularly coordinated across countries. There are even concerns about incoherence within countries in terms of policy making. And what is particularly worrying is that the policies which are being put in place and the risks of new policies are going to weaken ties, digital ties between companies and economies. Now, at its core, the reason why this is a concern is that so many of the successful and innovative business models that we've seen over the past couple of decades in the digital space have relied on scale one way or the other. And whether it's the collection or dissemination of information, the processing of information and data, scale is absolutely central. So anything that starts cutting up the world into different pots of data is almost certainly a step backwards. So starting from the left then, we see the digital economy again becoming very ubiquitous, governments racing to try and quote catch up and putting in place lots of regulations, and yet there's no systematic inventory of policy. There have been interesting initiatives undertaken over time. We do see, for example, every year the US Trade Representative's Office puts out a report on the barriers that worry it. Now these reports, I think, do provide you with some sense about what matters seem to be troubling American business. But there is the USTR does not claim to be doing a serious mapping exercise. They are obviously engaged in trying to advance their country's commercial interests. A second initiative which was very valuable was done by the ESIPE think tank in Brussels, where for 15 months they did try and put together a systematic collection of information and so some degree of mapping across them. Unfortunately, that initiative was not sustained, and so we have an excellent snapshot from perhaps the middle of the last decade, but we don't have much information since. And the last group which is working in this area is, of course, the OECD. And the OECD does fine work. I think it's really important when you read the OECD's work to read carefully how they define the scope of what they're doing. Because I think the approach taken by the OECD, which is very valuable, has been to look at various aspects of regulation of the digital economy and try and do them in some depth. And they've recently put out a mapping paper for the issues which are being discussed in the JSI talks in Geneva. And these are very valuable pieces of work. But the OECD is very careful not to claim that they're trying to cover all of the waterfront. And so again, in each of these areas, although our knowledge has been taken forward, there is still no systematic inventory of policy. Yet, as we over time, we're seeing an increased demand for high quality information from a lot of different sources. Companies need to be able to engage with governments. Governments, of course, need to be able to reciprocate. And so there's all of the business government relationships on digital issues require, or at least could benefit from high quality information. There are dialogues between regulators. There's been proposals, as we know, for a data and technology forum. And here, of course, this is a work in progress with the G7 summit recently, and soon the EU-US recent summit as well. We see digital provisions in regional trading agreements, and we also see interesting bilateral accords like the DEPA as well, which of course, if they're designed properly, should draw upon systematic inventories of policies. And I've already made mention of the JSI talks in Geneva. So if anything, this this policy innovation that we're seeing should be driving up the demand for information for an inventory. Unfortunately, that inventory doesn't exist. And so there is a concern that policy choices might be flawed. And this has real important implications. This is not a theoretical matter. If countries do not get their e-commerce policies right, it may well hold back the development of business by small and medium-sized enterprises, the cross-border supply of goods and services by them. So there's a real commercial consequence to this. And it's very important to identify, to recognize and acknowledge that the consequences of poor e-commerce policies are not just felt by the large big tech companies, but also by SMEs. Flawed policy choice and this sort of regulatory overdrive is driving up policy uncertainty, and we have seen more generalized measures of policy uncertainty rise very sharply over the past decade. Evan, you mentioned the possible fragmentation of the internet and the compromising business models which are based on scale. There have also been, I think, quite plausible arguments that the pace of innovation and the nature of certain innovations is held back if access to data is limited. And all of these problems are compounded when firms and governments get into guessing games about what each other is doing. And that, of course, is a result of there being insignificant or insufficient transparency. So we're on a trajectory at the moment which could go wrong. And I think what we need is an initiative which begins to map digital policy so as to be able to inform policy choice. In fact, in reflecting on what a mapping could deliver, my colleagues and I think that there are 6 possible payoffs from such mappings. The first is to provide early warning systems so that all stakeholders can engage with the rule makers. The second is to spot emergent trends and potential departures from best practice and the threats to fragmentation. The third is to support better national policy formation by providing up-to-date information which will facilitate more objective comparisons across different policy alternatives. The fourth area is to nurture the development of international best practices or better practices, which enable, which hopefully will help align policies across countries. And notice I use the word better practices. There is no implicit view in my mind or my colleagues about there being a single solution to many of these problems. And indeed, I'll come back to that point later. Transparency itself builds confidence, and confidence is a prerequisite for cooperation and coordination between governments and government agencies across borders. And so we need transparency helps, I think, sustain or enhance cooperation, which I think everyone would regard as being potentially desirable. And the last point, which is important, is, of course, trade negotiators and people engaging in deliberations in international fora need to have high quality information about what is going on around the world, so as to be able to develop positions for further cooperation between countries, or indeed to help head off potential trade tensions and disputes. And so we see a lot of information, a lot of benefits from an inventory. Now, of course, many of you have tracked the world trading system over time would look at this list and recognize that similar such benefits and transparency have been identified before in other areas of policy. My contention is not that these are 6 new benefits, but many of them which we have benefited from and seen in the past as being important in other areas of policy, also apply in the digital policy space as well. And so this, I think, is the sort of, if you want to frame it more positively, this is the positive benefits of good mapping. The last slide emphasized the downside, this emphasizes the upside. Well, enough on the motivation. What I want to do now is to move on and to tell you what we've been doing. So let me introduce then the Digital Policy Alert. So this time last year, around this time last year, we began an elaborate scoping exercise where we tried to track and understand what different policies were concerning governments, business, and other stakeholders. This led us to identify 12 policy or regulatory domains, which we thought were particularly important. And in consultation with experts, we then refined what policy interventions underlying each of these 12 should be within scope. And then we put together what we call Project Matterhorn. As you highlighted, Evan, this is not our first rodeo when it comes to mapping policies. We have been mapping policies, traditional commercial policies, tariffs, subsidies, normal, traditional local content requirements, and all other manner of traditional policies, trade policies, for over a decade. And so what we wanted to do is to take that experience in mapping policies there, plus the substantial investments we have made in trying to acquire in an automated fashion information about what governments are doing around the world, combine machines and trade policy expertise to come up with mappings for the digital policy space. We decided to break down our deliverables into 2 parts, or 2 data products, and you'll see that one builds upon the other. The first data product is an early warning system, which seeks to track what goes on in the G20 countries and the EU member states. And what we've done is if we take the beginning of last year, 2020, as the starting point, what we're trying to do is systematically map pretty much as fast as we can the regulatory and policy events which are unfolding in the digital space. And I'll show you some of the numbers later for what we are finding. But the goal of this early warning system is to be able to allow firms, governments, journalists, analysts, and the like to see what is going on and to be able to interpret emergent policy trends. And sometimes some of these initiatives we catch earlier enough so whereby the private sector and others can engage with governments during consultation processes. So we're hoping that this early warning system actually enables or supports engagement between different stakeholders and national authorities. Well, this early warning system was launched on the 15th of April. We started collecting information earlier than this, but we launched it formally 2 months ago, literally 2 months and 1 day ago. And what we have been doing is essentially feeding and updating this particular early warning system over time. And in the process of doing this, just as we saw with the Global Trade Alert, we're learning a lot about all of the different dimensions of public policy which are relevant. And this in turn will then feed into the second data product, which we're working on now, which is developing detailed mappings of digital policies, identifying the key dimensions upon which they should be mapped, and then trying to find a way to systematically and collect that information, enter that information, and present it to users in a way that is useful. So our initial goal is to map the policy developments in the G20, and then from then we are going to roll that out from the fall of this year onwards. So at the moment, what you can find on the Global Trade Alert website is a separate page devoted to the early warning system, which we've called the Digital Policy Alert. This will then be supplemented by detailed policy mappings, and we will migrate all of this onto its own dedicated website soon. So this is the Matterhorn project. You can see we have two other mountains in the top right-hand side, and these reflect two other project scopes, which we hope to develop over time, involving essentially more countries, both being tracked in the early warning system and mapped. So this is the starting point that we've pursued. Now, when it comes to these detailed policy mappings, let me say a bit more about this, because I think it's really worth reflecting on this a lot. And we've read a lot about of how other people have characterized digital trade policies, and it made us think of perhaps a different way of tackling this problem, approaching this problem. When we looked at the work of especially ESIPE and USTR, we see largely form-based mapping of policies. That is, policies are identified by, or policies which are of a certain type typically get tracked. Now, for those of us who've been looking at trade policy over time, we've seen huge amounts of innovation in what governments are doing in terms of trying to influence cross-border commerce. And so as a result, we have tended to approach the matter slightly differently. We tend to take the view that what matters are any policies which have certain key attributes. And it's the attributes that we home in on. And so to put this in traditional terms, sometimes people might refer to a traditional trade policy as being protectionist. We would prefer to say something like, well, it discriminates in favor of local firms against foreign firms. So rather than emphasizing the label, instead we emphasize the attribute. And we've carried that logic over to mapping digital trade policies. And we think this is very important because it avoids having to use certain loaded terms, which we've noticed come up a lot in discussions on digital trade policy. And indeed, in the webinars that Johannes and I have been doing over the past 2 months, almost always people raise these questions. So some people obsess about the phrase or think only in terms of the phrase digital trade barriers. You won't hear that much from us because we're interested in is which attributes does a regulation have. We don't want to go down this rabbit hole about contesting or not contesting the right to regulate. That is not of our interest. What we are interested in doing is understanding what are the attributes of policy that could be commercially important and important for economic development and for societal development. Another rabbit hole that many people go down to is the moment they hear the word best practice, they think that anyone doing a mapping is actually interested in only one type of best practice, or they have a single view about how a policy should be constructed. Let me be explicit about this and saying that what is interesting here is whether or not a particular policy meets a certain type of best practice. Let me elaborate just a little bit more. If you've looked at the OECD's recent study or mapping of policies which are being discussed in the JSI talks, the OECD rightly takes the view that in areas where there are multiple potential best practices, that the thing to do is to benchmark a country's regulations against all of the existing best practices rather than highlighting one or two or selecting one or two. And that's probably the right way to go. So if I use the phrase best practice, I'm not referring to any one in mind. It might be better to call them either best practices or better practices, which might be a little bit more modest as well. So what are these attributes that I want to emphasize? Well, there are 4 that we originally identified. And in consultation with colleagues, there could well be 2 more we should add. And I think one of the most interesting things we could talk about today is whether there are other attributes which should be added to a digital mapping. But let me discuss the 4 attributes I want to emphasize now. The first one is the classic discrimination question. Does the policy treat domestic and foreign firms in an even-handed way. So some notion of equal treatment. Second attribute is the existing policy best practice, or will a proposed policy meet some notion of best practice, and if so, which notions of best practice? The third attribute is, does the policy, or rather, is the policy transparent? And there, of course, transparency, there are different aspects to that which can be broken down as well. And then fourthly, is there possible to have meaningful engagement with a government or an agency that is formulating regulations? And so these are four different attributes that we think should be tracked, and which, with an understanding of both the proposal or the nature of a regulation or law and the manner in which it is being proposed and enforced, one could begin to map out these different particular attributes, or whether these attributes have been met or are relevant in a particular case. Now, an interesting question is, are there any more attributes? And we had one extremely useful conversation with a colleague who tracks this area very carefully, and he made the observation that there are probably two other attributes you might want to look at, especially in areas where the regulations impinge upon the private sector. The first, as he charmingly put it, was whose hair gets pulled. So when a government enforces a regulation, against whom is it the enforcement targeting, and who pulls their hair? In other words, who ultimately decides whether or not a sanction is imposed, or a permission or a license is granted. And here, just recall that if we were talking about competition law and the digital economy in Europe, by and large, the European Commission, and especially DG Competition, in particular the Commissioner of Competition, makes the final decision. It can be appealed, but but ultimately that takes a lot of time. In the United States, competition law cases or antitrust law cases are determined by judges. So the agencies have to make a case to a judge. So in the US, a judge pulls the hair. In Brussels, the Commissioner of Competition pulls the hair. And this might have very different, very different political economies, very different dynamics might develop. And so these two attributes might be worth thinking about too. But as I said, I'd be really interested in whether colleagues have any others that we should be adding to this list. So our intention then is to take the policy interventions in the 12 areas that we've identified, and for each of them in the G20's countries to map them out, taking account of sort of basic characteristics, of course, things like the dates when measures came into force, which agencies are responsible and the like, and then elaborate and enrich that basic information with attribute mapping that we're doing here. And of course, our goal ultimately is to be able to enable users to be able to search and compare across digital policy interventions across these attributes. So this will then facilitate the types of more detailed and we hope meaningful comparisons across countries' policies. And for countries which are thinking of introducing a new policy, they'll have a much more systematic way of comparing what other countries have done. So this is very much where we want to take the second data product in the second half of this year. Well, rather than end on that, I'd rather go back to what we have accomplished already and start talking about the emerging policy trends or regulatory trends that we've seen in the first 2 months of our early warning system. And you can see that we've been very busy. Since we have already documented 718 events that have been undertaken since the 1st of January 2020. Just to remind you, these are regulatory events or policy events in the 12 policy areas we talked about, plus, and they relate only to the G20 countries and the EU member states. So these 718 regulatory events refer to 490 policy or regulatory matters. So it could be then that a policy evolves over time and is associated with multiple events. And indeed, that is what we've been seeing as we track. Just to give you a sense of where we were when we launched this initiative 2 months ago, I believe we were around 470 or so events. So the last 2 months have seen a considerable expansion in our coverage, and we are scaling up more and more. What have we learned from this mapping or this early warning system so far? Well, one thing is to confirm what many others have found or who have tried to tally up policy interventions. And the first, the major finding there often is that the governance of data, rules concerning the storage, the transfer, the use of data and the like, these are by far the most prevalent area where we're seeing regulatory developments. And here the United States, the EU, the European Commission and the EU member states are the champions. They are engaging in a huge amount of regulatory development here, which we're seeking to track over time. So we confirm what others have found, which is that the sort of governance of data is a very important, is a very active area of policy making. Now, just if we want to reflect on what this might mean, if we think about the JSI negotiations, only very recently have the JSI negotiators started talking about governance of data. And so in that sense, the area where there is the most action is the area which has received some, possibly the least amount of attention so far from the JSI negotiators. And so this is a bit of a mismatch, and we hope that the JSI negotiators will catch up. The second area where we see a lot of action is in content regulation and intellectual property rights related matters. And here we've documented 129 of these interventions. And this is an area which is extremely active as well, as governments seek to influence what is shared online, amongst other matters. We also have a large number of regulatory interventions and licensing actions. So licensing actions here often relate to the license to operate, could relate to OTT services, it could relate to the ability of companies like TikTok to be able to operate in certain jurisdictions. And of course, this is an area where it has got increasingly tied up in geopolitics as well. A fourth area where we're seeing a lot of action is in competition law and regulation, largely targeting the big tech firms. You may have seen an article in last week's Economist, which argues that there has been a renewed interest on both sides of the Atlantic in using competition law as a tool to try and shape competitive dynamics in the digital economy. And we can certainly confirm that that is a very active area where a number of competition agencies are really trying to establish names for themselves in this area. And I say that without in any way endorsing what they're doing, because there is a potential here for misalignment in regulatory or enforcement approaches. We see 44 events relating to foreign direct investments. Here, there are both cross-cutting regulatory changes, so ones which have to do, for example, with the the screening of FDI on apparently national security grounds, and there are often very sector-specific initiatives as well. So these are the top 5, and then the 6th most frequent area of innovation is one which, of course, has received a lot of attention recently because of the G7 work, but on the taxation of digital commerce is also receiving a considerable amount of attention as well. So now, of course, these are counts of events and associated policy interventions. We've said nothing about the economic impact of them, but it does give you a sense about where the regulatory overdrive is taking place. And it does also provide you with a sense of the wide range of policies which bear upon the digital economy. And it does beg the question, the extent to which governments in their national deliberations are applying policies or designing policies in a coherent manner. And of course, if there's potential incoherence at the national level, the potential for incoherence at the international level is even greater. So what we're beginning to see, I think, with this type of information is the nature of the huge nature of the challenge in helping to or encouraging governments to put in place coherent, well thought through policies which reflect better practices which we may or may not observe around the world. So Evan, let me come to a close here. I've perhaps spoken a little bit longer than I had anticipated, but I hope to have given you a rather thorough overview of what we're seeking to do here as we go forward. And let me just show you the last slide, just in case any colleagues and anyone watching this is interested in subscribing to our updates. We do have a specific subscription service which is free and which you can sign up for and which is active. We send out this information very regularly, and I would urge colleagues to stay in touch and engage with us on these matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. That's, hang on, I think I need to unmute myself. Yeah, thank you very much, Simon. I found that tremendously interesting, and I'm sure everybody else did too. I will now hand over to Eunice for her commentary as our first discussant. Eunice, you have the floor.
Thank you, Evan, and thank you, Simon, for that really excellent presentation. I will focus today my remarks on two questions, and I think just to provide some value add from the perspective of the private sector. And the first question is really, why is digital policy transparency important to the private sector? And the second question would be, what are the risks of digital fragmentation and protectionism? So on the first question, why is this important to the private sector? You've seen, from what Simon has showed us, that the pace of digital policy development has been astounding in the past couple of years. To date, I think the DPA, when I last checked, it showed over 700 events since January last year. And we at Google, we see these policies coming in fast and furious, and especially since COVID, when sort of sectors, economies have digitized. We see more and more of these policies that are being made by governments all over the world. And we spend at Google a massive amount of time analyzing these policies, these regulations, figuring out what it means for Google, how it would impact our products, how it will impact our services, and how, importantly, how we can make sure that we comply with the policies and regulations that have been put forward. And you can imagine, if a large company like Google has spent so much resources and time just to track, number one, the policies that are in place, and two, to implement them, right? And to see, how to make sure that we are kosher and we are in compliance. This is something that's potentially prohibitive for smaller businesses, right? So a telehealth startup, for example, that wants to expand globally may just decide that it's just too challenging to re-architect its product or service, to be in compliance with the digital regulations in all the markets that it wants to enter. So there are potential consequences, I think, for the broader economy, if there is sort of a multiplication of divergent rules in the digital space, and two, I think no attempt to, one, track, and two, sort of foster some kind of coherence and interoperability. So the second question really is then, what are the risks of these of digital fragmentation and protectionism? If we take two steps back, right, and we recall the evolution of the internet, it was really designed to be a network of networks, which evolved from a set of networking principles and technology building blocks that emphasize openness, interoperability, and maximize interconnection. So digital technologies, to that extent, were by design meant to be global in scale. And the power and potential of these technologies really work best when there are multiple connections and when they are used across different countries and economies. So we see some actualization of that vision today, right? On the trade and commerce front, especially, sort of the new opportunities and growth opportunities that have come up. Evan mentioned earlier, the number, I think this number differs, but, from what we have, we think that digital trade accounts for over 6 trillion of economic activity globally. And it really enables inclusive trade and growth, right? So a small business owner in Cambodia or in Cameroon can sell to the world, right? As long as he or she has an internet connection. And you see millions of jobs that are attributable to the internet and how e-commerce has been a lifeline for many businesses. So when governments, sort of try to impose national borders, digital borders and regulation on the internet, then it becomes especially challenging. What Simon has highlighted in terms of the data flow rules, the data rules, data governance rules, has been sort of the key sort of barrier here in certain countries where you see them prohibiting sort of the flow of data across borders, or sort of imposing requirements like requiring companies to store a copy of the data locally, or to have a mirror copy in on-premise. So really, ultimately, when governments pursue new regulations and policies, one, either in a protectionist manner that breaks with long-standing international trade principles, or when they turn inward and they make digital policies in a vacuum without considering how they interoperate with other jurisdictions, or how they align with international standards, the impacts are felt across the economy and across the globe. And depending on where you live, what would happen is you would receive a very different experience on the internet. The information that you have access to, the products that are available to you, and potentially even the security of your data could be negatively impacted by these requirements. So, to close up, really, digital fragmentation can really have an impact on the potential of the internet in contributing towards growth. It hits small businesses especially hard, and it would really limit the potential for us to solve important public policy challenges like climate change, like vaccine development, if data cannot be allowed to flow across borders. And so, initiatives like the Digital Policy Alert are very timely in providing a real-time understanding of the policies that are out there. But I think more importantly, I think it's a great starting point for a more thoughtful consideration and debate on how to make digital trade easier for the end users. The better practices, right, that policymakers should look at, and ultimately how to make digital policies more interoperable across borders. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Eunice. That's very pertinent, I think, and the emphasis on the potential costs to businesses, especially the SMEs that everybody is talking a lot about at the moment, is very important. And these are obviously equally some of the businesses that have suffered a lot during the COVID pandemic. So the maintaining open digital trade is also, I think, an important part of the recovery from COVID. So very pertinent. Thank you very much. Patrick, your turn.
Thank you, Evan, and thank you for the invitation. And thank you also to Simon and Eunice. Simon set the scene very nicely, and Eunice has picked up on some pretty important issues around opacity, uncertainty, the costs of fragmentation and so on. And I think these things are pretty self-evident. When you get older, you are kind of more tempted to reminisce. And since I was born in the first half of the 20th century, I'm going to reminisce a little bit, only a minute, you'll have to bear with me, about all this business. I joined the GATT, which is the forerunner of the WTO, in 1980. In those days, the only way we could communicate across distance was something called the telex, apart from the telephone, of course. The telex was this noisy machine that made holes in papers and sent ink communications across the wires. And then in 1986, when we were launching the Uruguay round of trade negotiations in Punta del Este, I was running around with texts, all these textual negotiations that always go on. Somebody came to me and gave me a piece of paper and said, this has just come in from Geneva, which is a contribution to a text. I said, what do you mean it's just come in from Geneva? How did it get here? We're talking about the stork and the baby or what? And this lady looked at me pityingly and said, you don't know what a fax is, do you? I said, well, actually, no, I don't. So this was a fax. That was 1986, and the GATT had just got its first fax as we were going to Punta del Este, and I hadn't seen it and hadn't really heard about it. And then all of a sudden we had screens we could look at with our typewriters. So, that was then. It was a much simpler world. And from there to here, it's just dramatic. That's 40 years ago. It's just really dramatic what's happened. And it's non-linear. It multiplies, it goes on and on, it gets more and more complex. And so governments in many ways have to play catch up the whole time. And I just want to say something about international agreements that are being attempted or have already been struck that seek to have provisions regulate across nations what you can do and what you can't do with e-commerce, or call it what you will, with the digital economy. And the truth is, it's extremely difficult, it seems to be so far, to get necessary specificity, actionability, and enforcement in these agreements. So I had a look just at the Indonesia-Australia agreement, just as an example. And when you look at the specific provisions in there on e-commerce, you have provisions, for example, on data localization, cross-border transfer of information by electronic means, source codes. And then you look at the language, and they make a rather clear and bold statement about not being able to do something. And then immediately follows with a paragraph saying, unless you have to. So these are you can't and you can provisions. And the same in the e-commerce negotiations in the WTO, for example, they've been, you can divide these into 6 broad themes. That's how they present it. One of those themes is trust and e-commerce. It seems to me trust is an outcome. I'm not sure how you negotiate trust per se. But I think these issues really speak to the difficulty and the challenge of making agreements across countries in these complex areas of activity that will be useful and won't just be aspirational. And so we definitely need more specificity. And I think an interesting question for Simon is this approach, this attribution approach, a way of doing that? Could you put attribution-oriented language into trade agreements and get more of a handle on what you're really trying to do and what kind of behavior you're trying to regulate? So Simon's approach on it basically builds on the form-based approach and looks at attributes. One of my questions about attributes is, to what extent do you get cross a line where you essentially talk about effects, and when you go down that road, you end up talking about motivations, that you have to attribute a particular motivation to an action, and then so you'd say, well, you did that because this is what you were trying to do, and I say, no, I didn't. And I did it because of this. And so there is a question. If you look at the mapping and you ask, so there are these questions that you point out in your paper. What was done? Where was it done? When was it done? Why was it done? Who did it? And you explain very nicely in your talk why those questions are important. But I wonder about the why question. I think the why question is potentially the trickiest in terms of the attribution of motivation. And it does remind me a little bit of the aims and effects conversations that we used to have in the WTO, and there's a legal questions about whether or not you can actually make operable rules that have to ask the question about what were you thinking when you did that, and whether that is something that's easily justiciable. I don't have an answer, and I don't think this invalidates by any stretch of the imagination what the attributes approach tries to do, because clearly when you have these provisions which say you can and you can't, and there's nothing around the can and you can't, you might say, well, we could get there eventually with precedent, but that's a pathway to real difficulty in terms of international cooperation. So anyhow, I think you've said it's a real interesting challenge about how to develop the concept of attributes. You had 4, and you were talking about another couple of attributes. I'm afraid I don't have anything constructive to offer, but I think it's something that's really worth thinking about. And I just want to ask Simon one question. That with your mountains, is the middle one Mount Kilimanjaro? Excellent. I thought it must be. Okay, well, on that, let me finish. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Patrick. I think you've also given us a fair bit to think about. Now, we've got one question so far in from Caroline Tam. Thank you for that. I will read it out, try and do justice to it, and then we can maybe see, I might invite Simon first of all to comment on what he's heard from the two discussants and from this question, and then we'll see where we go in the light of any further questions. So what Caroline Tam says is, fast and furious is almost an understatement when we refer to digitization of the economy. Hence, in a sense, is it even more challenging for policymakers because they need to, in a sense, improvise as they go along in order to play catch up to what is occurring in reality? So if policy is being made along the way, how much more difficult must it be for corporates to follow and comply? How then would our learned speakers advise compliance professionals to go about making sure that they and their companies are compliant and on top of a fluid policy environment? I'll repeat that. How then would our learned speakers advise compliance professionals to go about making sure that they and their companies are compliant and on top of a fluid policy environment? One immediate answer is to subscribe to the Digital Policy Alert, but I won't say any more than that. I'll hand that question over, if I may, first of all, together with the other comments we've heard, to Simon for any comments you might have, Simon.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Eunice and to Patrick for their comments, as well as for the question as well. I think Eunice provided a sort of excellent rationales as to why we want to, or rather why we need mappings like this, why we need the global public good of transparency in this area. I'm not sure I have much to add. I think she really fluently laid out the connections between a sort of a bad policy, opaque policy, and its adverse consequences, and not just consequences in the economic sphere. I mean, I like the point towards the end about how cross-border data flows are important for things like vaccine development and the like. And if you think about the need to put together large pools of individuals who have to be tested at different stages of a vaccine's development, again, this would require cross-border data flows as well. So I'm not sure I have more to add on to what Eunice has said. I would strongly endorse the sentiments which were expressed. With respect to Patrick's observations and his trip down memory lane, which I thought was very valuable, I think he actually highlights here and reminds us something that I often have to remind my students now that I'm getting on as well, and that is that very little in life is new, and that we have seen some of these problems before. And he's quite right. I mean, when he asked me specifically about motivations and attributes, we have been very careful in the Global Trade Alert never to classify policy based on what motivations, what governments say they are, and nor have we tried to infer what they are. We have, in some cases, in the back end of our monitoring for traditional trade policy, indicated if a government has claimed they've done something for a certain reason. But in terms of our overall assessment of this and classify the mapping of it, that plays no role. And I think that's very important, because I don't want to go down a rabbit hole of motivations, right? What is it that the country said they were doing? Having said that, asking the question, if there is a dispute to a regulator, what were you thinking when you did this? What evidence has supported your decision making? What alternatives did you consider when you decided to make this recommendation? Those types of observations, which have been made in a number of areas of regulation of the WTO, I think of SPS, TBT just for some, I'm sure it's true in some of the service sectors as well. These types of questions could well be very useful as well if one was interrogating a particular decision by a regulator. For those of us putting together mappings, however, that might not be so easy to do since we can't interrogate them. But what I think we could do is look for what evidence does a regulator point to as justifying the approach that they've taken. And we could note that without either endorsing it or criticizing it. But I do think there is a very important distinction between motivations and attributes. Patrick rightly noted that when it comes to breaking out the attributes, we do ask the why question. So there's only so far we can avoid this. But I think the way back in has already been hinted at Patrick and a little bit by myself as well. So I think that's actually a very important point to going forward. I think Patrick's observation about the you can and you can't, sorry, you can't and you can, let's get it around the right way, our regular provisions in FTAs is spot on. And it really speaks to the fact that in almost all of the digital areas, there is a public policy objective unrelated to trade, which is seen as being very important. And so when does that trump? And when do we allow that to trump? And to what standard do we hold governments who want to use that trump card? I think is a very, very important point, which we will have to think more about. Then Patrick went even further deeper and asking, well, and I think this links very nicely to what Eunice said too. If the regulatory space in this, if the digital technologies are moving, galloping ahead, governments are trying to catch up, operating individually, then what role can trade agreements and other things play, given that there's going to be so much innovation after an agreement has been signed? And so that really does make you wonder if what one should think about are principles rather than very specific, targeted obligations. Maybe one should talk about these are the acceptable principles to guide policy. But again, I'm very early in my thinking about that. I mean, I would want to reflect on other precedents as well. Now, if it's difficult to design trade agreements, which will stand the test of time, I can fully subscribe to the question which came in, which you explained, Evan, from Mrs. Thane. One does have to wonder to what extent businesses can keep up. It's interesting how the way that was phrased, how can businesses make sure that they are compliant? I'm not sure this is a business where one can offer any guarantees. So maybe the right way to think about compliance here is minimizing the risk of sanction or action against a company, given that there appears to be such a fast-moving area. But I do know one thing for sure, which is that compliance officers will need to have exactly the type of inventory and mappings that we want to produce. And I think actually a very interesting area of cooperation between us and those colleagues in the private sector, especially compliance colleagues, is if there is an organization of compliance officers and the like who want to make progress in this area, then it might be useful to speak to them and to be able to figure out what type of information do they need, in what form is it very useful, and how can we then support compliance officers who are serious about tracking developments over time. Let me pause there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Simon. I'll just, before I pass on to the new crop of questions, which is quite significant, I'll just ask both Eunice and Patrick if they have anything to add at this stage, or will you wait until we've heard some more questions? No? Okay. So I will now share with you some further questions, which I think are all very interesting and relevant. Here is one from Jikon Lai from RSIS for Simon. How would you identify best practice? Isn't best practice a loaded term? Well, I think you already mentioned it can be. Wouldn't it be better for your project to refer to common or popular policies rather than best practice? So I think you've noted that. I'm going to move on to one from the Executive Deputy Chairman of RSIS, Ong Keng Yong. Good to have you with us, Keng Yong. Thanks for joining. what kind of role do we envisage for the big tech firms and private sector in making rules and policies for the digital economy? What kind of role do we envisage for the big tech firms and private sector in making rules and policies for the digital economy? And maybe I'll contribute one more at this stage. And then that's a group for you to think about. This is from Giant Menon. Many developing countries fear that they may fall further behind in the acceleration towards a more digitized world. This fear may drive their policy towards digital trade. How do you think that liberalizing digital trade may affect inequality in the short run and in the long run in developing countries? So I think those are three good questions to have a look at now, and I will, and then there's a couple more that we also need to take up, but let's deal with them now. I will, if I may, ask Simon perhaps to intervene first. The first one was addressed specifically to him, and then ask the others if they want to come in, particularly on some of the more general questions that, basic policy questions that were the next two. Thanks very much. Simon.
Thanks, Evan. So to get to Jaikon's question directly, I mean, as you heard in my presentation, I'm sympathetic to the view that the phrase best practice needs to be used very carefully. And I use it in the following way. I think when we're doing attribute mapping, we should consider the practices which have been promulgated internationally by groups of countries or organizations which claim to have some type of either general application or relevance. So again, it's not Simon saying this is a best practice, it's other people saying it's a best practice, and presumably we need some evidence that that best practice has, or alleged best practice, has been taken up by a sufficiently large number of people or or governments. So I think I'm very sensitive to the point that Jaikon's making. We are not going to be in the business of saying, when we do the mappings, we should not be in the business of pre-selecting what we think best practices are. Once we've done the mappings, and then once we have had an opportunity to reflect on what's in the mappings, what we're learning in terms of the effects of different policies, then at a later stage when it comes to sort of engaging in the policy debate, we may have views about what is better or worse policy options. But I think when we're doing the mappings, we're not going to, I think, introduce our own blinders at that point. Let me just make one short observation on Jayant's question as well. Here, Jayant has a two-parter to his question. I'm just going to refer to the first sentence. He says, many developing countries fear that they may fall further behind in the acceleration towards a more digitalized world. Well, let me say, I mean, having tried to now read very actively the policy debate in G20 countries and the EU member states, there are plenty of countries with high per capita incomes who fear falling behind as well. So this should not be framed, I think, as a north-south issue. I think this should actually be framed about, how do we start thinking about better regulations, or what policy mixes are more supportive of digital technologies and digital commerce, which delivers the greatest benefits to the world. So I would urge it. I can fully understand why one might think that it's harder for developing countries to keep up, maybe on capacity grounds. But I run into plenty of very worried officials in high per capita income countries too. And so this fear of falling behind, I think, is something which we should not discount. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. Do either Patrick or Eunice have anything to add on any of those three questions?
Yeah, maybe let me just jump in on that private sector big tech question, since I am here. Thank you, Ambassador Ong. I think that's a great question, and it's, I can't see you, but thank you for the question. I think there's this general sense that in many trade agreements that are negotiated, whether bilaterally or multilaterally at the WTO, it's often a very opaque process where negotiators go into a room and then they come out with a text, and then you're expected to then implement it. So I think this consultation process between policymakers, negotiators, and the private sector players who are ultimately the end users of these agreements, it's extremely important, and sort of a better engagement there. But at the same time, I think it's also important for tech companies to better explain to governments and policymakers how our internal processes work, right? For example, like when there's a regulation that's made on the removal of videos from YouTube, right? And people saying, like, regulations saying, okay, it has to be removed within 2 hours. Often there isn't really any consultation on whether this is something that's even technically feasible, for the company that has to implement it. What kind of turnaround time is a reasonable one, a realistic one. And for companies, I think better explaining how, for example, technologies like AI is used in the processes of screening out, sort of illegal videos or content, and when sort of human reviewers come into play and into the process. I think that would, sort of more sharing of this kind of information on how products work, how the back end sort of processes work, I think would be really important, because ultimately it's a two-way street, right? When we come to making policies or rules, and especially in an area that's so fast changing and fast moving like the digital space.
Thanks, Eunice. Very useful. Patrick, anything to add?
Yeah, on the Mr. Mellon's question about the digital divide, I think this is a very, very real issue. But there is a good story. I think a lot of it is to do with infrastructure and access, frankly, around bandwidth and the core infrastructure that you need for this. But it's not entirely a bleak situation. I think progress is being made. It just maybe needs to happen faster. But I've been looking at Afghanistan, for example, and in 10 years, the access to mobile phones, to iPhones, has multiplied sixfold. And that's still only a third of the population, but sixfold in 10 years is something. Huh? And as for access to the internet, it's increased 2.5 times. And that's Afghanistan with all the challenges it has. So I think it's something we really have to watch, but it is something that can be fixed. So I think I try to look at this in a more optimistic way than throwing up my hands and saying, this is just going to make things worse for underprivileged societies. On the tech question, the private sector, I mean, I really think that if these things are done without them being in the room next door and really being consulted, then we're going to get into trouble. And I think one good example of how this has happened is a digital services tax, which is a mess. It's truly a mess. You try to charge profits tax on sales, and you get all sorts of unfortunate outcomes. So there are solutions. It's not that big tech saying we don't want to get taxed. It's saying let's do it right. So I do think it's absolutely essential, and it's not always been the way governments have operated, but I think they really need to. Thanks.
Very much agree with that. So thanks, Patrick. Now we have 3 more questions that have come in, which I think are all very equally very pertinent and interesting. I will read them out, and then we'll invite answers. There's another one from Ong Keng Yong, which is, should we have a new international body to develop trade rules for the digital economy? In other words, forget about building on the existing multilateral setup for making trade rules. Well, it's true, it's not doing terribly well at the moment, but anyhow, should we have a new international body to develop trade rules for the digital economy? In other words, forget about building on the existing multilateral setup. One from Casey Lee, addressed to Simon, which says, in building your database, do you have a good sense of how digital policies percolate across different countries? Are there countries that play the role of trend setters? In what ways and what are the consequences? And one from Richard Pomfret, which is, should we distinguish between more or less important events, in quotes, rather than counting G20 measures? The similar chapters in the CPTPP, chapter 14, and RCEP, chapter 12, cover 19 countries, including 3, soon to be 4 G7 countries, China and other significant trading nations. Shouldn't they take precedence in mapping? So I hope those questions are clear. Does anyone want me to repeat? No? Okay. So I may, as I've done before, with your permission, hand over to Simon first, and then to the others as appropriate. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks, Evan. I'll try and answer the questions in reverse order. So I hope Richard takes actually some comfort from the fact that by covering the G20 and the EU member states, we are covering most of the what he might call significant nations. I think we've got them all pretty much in. The deeper point he raises is about how to summarize the information. And I think because we're at still a relatively early stage in terms of our early warning system, and we're still collecting, I think, vast amounts of information. To go beyond counts at this stage is probably not a very good idea. I think we should be devoting energies to expanding the base of information. And then once we have a lot more of it, and I'm talking maybe double, triple the amount we have at the moment, then we can also devote some time to figuring out how do we filter between more or less important measures and on what objective basis to do that. One, I guess, defensive counts is that they weight every piece of information equally, which, or put it differently, they don't impose the subjective weights of the reviewer on it. So I think that's, I think a defense of counts, but counts are certainly not the height of our ambition in this area. So I think that's where we are now and the reasons why we are there now. Casey asks a question about cross-border transfer of policy and regulatory approaches. This, of course, is an incredibly important question. We hope to be able to say something about that once we have done our mappings, because then we'll be able to compare different regimes based on the attributes that they have. So that's something for down the road. I understand fully why Casey is raising it, and of course, given the huge amount of policy proposals coming out of Brussels at the moment, and the long-standing so-called Brussels effect when it comes to regulations, I can see exactly why this question has been put on the table, and it's a very good one. As for having a new international body to develop trade rules, well, if it's a trade rule, I would hope that there would be some alignment with the existing trade rules. So I tend to be a little bit worried when I hear people talk about that. If the question had been framed slightly differently, however, which is to say, should we have a new international body which will scope out what governments are doing, solicit private sector input, help governments talk through different policy choices to the extent that there's any agreement on or alignment on certain policy approaches or regulatory approaches. So that type of highly supportive but not necessarily rule-making organization, there might be a case for that in the digital area. Indeed, the case has been made for a data and technology board to do exactly that. I'm sure our friends at the OECD would like to think that they should be that organization, but of course there are membership questions there which would possibly preclude that. So I think if Ken Yong's question had been about, do we need an international body to help facilitate alignment across countries and help reduce the fragmentation that Eunice and I have talked about, I think there must be some merit there, but if it comes to hard trade rules, I hope we won't throw the experience of the last 100 years out of the window. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Simon. Eunice, anything to add?
Yeah, maybe just to add, I agree with what Simon said about the WTO being the place for sort of rules that are related to trade on the digital space. I cannot foresee any new organization that is formed that would avoid the political problems that the WTO basically has, right? But I just want to flag that, when you talk about actually more coherence and reducing fragmentation in the digital economy, right? It's more than the WTO. Then it becomes, also, sort of the OECD, where sort of digital taxation rules are being discussed. And then you have like international standards bodies like the ISO, which set standards on like e-payments or on cloud security standards. So all these other organizations, I think, have a role to play in reducing the kind of fragmentation in the broader digital economy.
Okay, thanks, Eunice. Patrick, anything to add?
Yeah, just on the question of a new international body, I think there's something very pertinent going on in the WTO at the moment with respect to the e-commerce negotiations, which speak to this question. There are some parties to that negotiation who believe that there will be no meaningful regulation of e-commerce if we don't jettison the most favored nation principle. In other words, if we don't jettison the rule that whatever is agreed applies for everybody. Certainly on the right side, maybe on the obligation side, it's a different story. But this systemically would be a wonderful recipe for fragmentation. I really hope it doesn't come to that, because it would be the beginning of the breakdown of international cooperation in this area. So I think the risk of thinking about new bodies actually right now, at least in terms of the WTO's deliberations in e-commerce, is in a rather precarious position. So I would be quite careful, I think, about thinking about that. Although I completely agree with Simon's proposition that we should have some kind of organization that would deepen understanding, be deliberative, and would be able to set the ground, that if it had authority, if it was considered to be neutral and serious, that could actually inform a better approach, a more cooperative approach to actually trying to write the rules. And I also think that Eunice's point is very important. That doesn't mean you don't have specialized agencies, international agencies that do particular things. And I mean, the best example of that, which is an old example, is in the standards field, and especially in the SPS's, the Phytosanitary Agreement in the WTO, where there's direct reference to commitments that are set by other organizations. So I think that is one way of doing it. I just think that whole lock, stock and barrel idea of just saying we can't agree to this in WTO, let's forget about that, let's try it somewhere else, is highly risky, especially in the existing situation. On the question of measuring the relative weights of different interventions, that is that question on that point. I think in the GTA, one way of dealing with this has been to actually, was what they've been doing in the GTA from time to time, is taking a particular sector, particular activity, and really digging deep in there. And it's not necessarily that you're making a very explicit, quantified judgment about relative gravity, but you're certainly getting to the question of what matters more and what matters less. And some of that works. So I think that's perhaps one way of going down that road. If you try to index these things, you're going to get all the standard problems of indexes, that somebody has to decide what the weighting is. Even if you say, well, we're not going to weight anything, which obviously you would want to do, you're still making a decision, a judgment. I think that's all. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Patrick, and everybody. That I'll just double check, but I think, yes, that brings us to the end of the questions. And unless there are any further questions, I think it's probably not a bad time to wrap up this session and let people get about their busy days, those of you who have busy days, unlike us retired people. And so oh, hang on, we seem to have another question that's coming. If you don't mind, I'll just look at this. Well, this isn't a question. This is Victor do Prado, our former colleague, saying great seminar, extremely useful. Thank you, Victor. Very good. Those are the sort of questions we like. Okay, so look, thank you all very much. Those the contributors, Simon, Patrick, Eunice, it's been extremely stimulating. I've certainly learned a lot, and I hope the participants, people who have been out there in our virtual meeting room have also found it useful. I'm not going to try and sum up. Just note that we're starting from the problem of mapping trade in digital trade. We've gone further afield into some very key policy areas, which I think strengthens the case where we started out, really, for informed debate, transparency, and a solid knowledge base in order to have a more enlightened, coherent, and effective debate of digital policies. So I think this simply underlines the importance of the sort of work that the people at St. Gallen and elsewhere are doing. And on that note, unless anybody has anything else to add, panelists, everybody happy? Right, I'll just say thank you once again to the good people at RSIS for putting this together. And we'll all sign off if that's okay. Right, thank you. Oh, Simon, yep, good.
I just wanted to say thank you. That was all. I was waving to say goodbye.
Okay, well, I wave goodbye to everybody. Goodbye, and thank you all for taking part, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.